Welcome to Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton-Short, Professor of Geography at the George Washington University and Chief Reader of Advanced Placement Human Geography. This discussion series is brought to you by the American Geographical Society, the foremost champion of geography for the benefit of society since 1851. We now return to Dr. Benton-Short's conversation with Dr. Lee Schwartz, Geographer of the United States, already in progress.
So let's talk a little bit about the geographer's perspective, maybe the spatial thinking skills that makes a difference when we're looking at things like power, territory, and conflict. And for example, let me just show you a map here. You've got a map that kind of reminds us that maybe not everything's always on land, that there could be water resources involved.
Yeah, I love this map because it shows so many different aspects that are related to boundaries, both land and maritime, as well as conflict, as well as access to resources. So in this case, I'll try to be as brief as possible. The boundary between Iraq and Iran was defined as the Talweg of the Shat al-Arab between the two countries. And interestingly, that the Talweg is the deepest part of the river, and that's a problem in and of itself because that changes as the waters shift. This is also the silt from upstream because of the desert climate has actually extended this boundary, the land boundary, out to where you see the arrow there for the international terminus of what is actually the land boundary, even though it appears to be out in water. And it's from there where you draw what are usually geometric lines out for the extent of territorial seas. And in this case, that territorial sea in the Persian Gulf captures a tremendous amount of oil. So where that land terminus is and where you draw the line from, once you go 200 nautical miles out, can really make a huge difference in the amount of territory that one or another country has. And in this case, we also have an issue of names, which our office is the chair that works on the Foreign Names Committee of the U.S. Board on Geographic Names, which determines what names need to appear on maps. In this case, there's a controversy or a conflict or by countries that would rather use the Arabian Gulf as opposed to the Persian Gulf. And names are emotional and they mean a lot to people. And this particular map also shows when a frigate was captured by the Iranians because they claimed that it was in their territorial seas. And we actually had GPS location from a helicopter above, I believe it was a helicopter that showed exactly where the Cornwall was located, which you could position on a map and show that it was indeed not in Iranian territorial waters. So we had lots of meetings at the State Department going over a lot of these issues. And so it shows that boundaries, names, resources, and conflict all are very intertwined. And there is no real authority over this, but geographers know how to address these the way they've done for many years.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about some of the conflict that's been going on in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger.
Yeah, another great example of the fact that that borders can play a role both to bring together and separate people, and sometimes both, depending on different circumstances. This is an area that is of intense concern because of counterterrorism in an area that is rather ungoverned space that happens to sit at the tri-point area of three countries shown on the map. And this particular product maps out the displaced persons that are conflict driven and not necessarily resource driven, but changes very rapidly because of seasonal issues, because of various different military interventions or lack of, because of outside influence of the militia groups that are active in the areas. And I should probably mention also that a large part of my office is dedicated to mapping in the classified realm, in which case there are other features that we bring into a map like this to indicate the even greater complexity than this map alone shows.
Right. How would this map be used by the State Department to maybe direct resources or kind of any other kind of way in which they might be able to use this information?
Well, I think this map was designed specifically because this is an area that traditionally has lots of migration, has had refugees and IDPs, over the past couple of decades, and we were trying to separate out the displacement that was specifically related to conflict and attacks that were taking place. And I think what you're seeing is on this map, the locus of where the attacks are also is the areas where you have most displacement. And this is particularly useful as these conflict-driven events are tracked over time. So a map like this is even more useful when you can repeat and show each month the change over time, and try to figure out. Sometimes we have other maps that show seasonal displacement because conflict takes place usually during certain seasons, not during the rainy season, for instance, because of migratory herds that are moving back and forth on areas that are in dispute. So there's a lot of different ways a map like this can be designed.
Yeah, that's great. Let's talk about something that we also know could potentially lead to conflict. And in this case, you've outlined part of the Ukraine. You want to talk about a little bit about this?
Sure, and I think you probably can eliminate that potentially from your question. And obviously, this is something that we are mapping intensively on a daily basis, given the current war in Ukraine. But this particular map was produced, the map was produced just as a reference map. But the story I wanted to tell about this map was when Russia annexed Crimea. It was just when the National Geographic was about to go to print with their atlas, and I think they only print that atlas once every 7 or 8 years. And at the time, they were going to show Crimea as Russian territory. And we had a meeting with lawyers from the National Geographic and the State Department, and decided that different conventions would need to be shown on maps. And in this case, it may be a nuance, but the distinction between Russia controlled and Russia occupied is something that was very important for our policymakers. We did not want to show Crimea at all as the same shading as Russia, and so all of our maps show Crimea firmly as continuing to be Ukrainian sovereign territory, despite the Russian illegal annexation of it. Interestingly enough, companies like Google, for instance, will show it as part of Russia if you log in from ru.com or whatever I forget the suffix of that is, and Ukraine, if you log in on a site from Ukraine and Google, it will show it as Crimea. We don't have the luxury of doing that, nor does it fit the purpose of supporting our foreign policy.
Right, but it sure reminds us about the power of maps and the power in terms of how we convey territory and control over territory, which is a powerful tool to have in the geographer's arsenal.
Correct, and there are cartographic tools we use all the time to make sure that we're providing the message that the map wants to show. So even though you can't play around with the data that comprise the map, there are different tools you can use to give your message. And I think this map pretty clearly shows Ukrainian sovereign territory.
Let's take a look at how the Office of the Geographer has become increasingly important and vital in terms of understanding some of the complex emergencies and war crimes that have really been part of the political geography of the last 20 or 30 years for sure. So let me show you one map that I want to start with. Here is the Rohingya in between Bangladesh and Burma.
Sure. So it wasn't until 1994 when the name of the office changed from the Office of the Geographer to the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues, when a new Undersecretary for Global Affairs was named at the Department of State. And since that time, we've really done a lot of work that try to show how important those issues, kind of the touchy-feely side of intelligence, human rights and refugees and food security and water security, are really important for global security and also for national security. And so some of the work we've done to highlight those areas have taken place in the world's most conflicted areas, because where you have wars and fighting, you tend to have displacement, and that's a refugee situation often. You have human rights violations. You have potential criminal activity that goes to international tribunals, and our office is actually the executive agent at the State Department for sharing information with those tribunals. And you have issues such as women's issues, which we follow, religious affairs, which are also a global issue. So anytime you have a complex crisis in an area, particularly we have different ethnic groups fighting one another, you have all of these types of issues that can be understood with maps, and by exploring them, you can relate these global issues to intense political conflicts that take place that comprise really many of the most contested geopolitical crises of the day, and a lot of these protracted crises as well. And this was an example of a type of study that we did built on the Darfur survey that I showed you earlier, which showed that the attacks that were taking place on the Rohingya Muslim minority in northern Rakhine state in Burma was systematic and widespread. Similar stories were being told in every single location where there were burnt villages. The villages were targeted because of the ethno-religious content of them. The destruction that took place was clearly targeted against them because of their particular ethnicity and religious affiliation. And we tracked a number of different types of war crime activity. And it wasn't until actually just last month that the Secretary of State at the Holocaust Memorial Museum declared that indeed this activity that took place in Burma by the military there against the Rohingya minority that fled to Bangladesh constituted genocide. And he cited in part the work that our office did in conjunction with other parts of the State Department, conducting a survey in Bangladesh, linking it back on the map to the atrocities that took place throughout Burma during this very short period of time.
I'm looking at the map and I'm seeing the Humanitarian Information Unit. Can you talk a little bit about how that unit works within your office?
Sure, thanks for bringing that up. I'd love to. The Humanitarian Information Unit, we formed that about 15 years ago. And the reason we formed it was based in part because our office was doing a lot of field work on humanitarian response, natural disaster, complex emergencies, where we were working with NGOs, UN agencies, to try to share with them GIS information and mapping expertise to help them plan for and mitigate humanitarian disasters, whether it be planning for refugee returns, or whether it be documenting human rights violations. And when we were preaching the value of geographic information for sharing data, and when we looked in our own backyard, we realized that the U.S. government was as guilty as anyone for having a lot of its information stovepiped. And a lot of information sat in classified sources when it didn't need to be there, largely because much of it was collected when we had warfighters in areas, for instance, in classified systems. And so we thought there was a need to create a unit that would integrate a lot of the information that either was unclassified or could be declassified, and establish mechanisms for sharing that information, first within the US government, but then more broadly with all the agencies that are increasingly our close partners in these types of responses. And so the HIU was formed. It was interagency in its organization in the beginning with participants from other US government organizations. And we have some military detailees, we have imagery analysts, and we have developed situations, I think, of strong trust with some partners. and we have shared information over the years on lots of different humanitarian emergencies. And we have a couple of programs and projects we work in close partnership with those agencies as well. And we have a website that's publicly available.
Yeah, so this is very consistent with what you were talking about in terms of just how much the office has evolved, particularly in the last 20 years, to deal with more of the types of crises and issues, from climate change and food security to issues of IDPs and refugees. It seems like this is a really important part of what you're providing to the U.S. government.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton-Short. Be sure not to miss the continuation of Dr. Benton-Short's conversation with Dr. Lee Schwartz, Geographer of the United States. And tune in for this and more great geography teaching resources at americangeo.org. Until next time.